So what I want to talk about is what a different world we are in and how we should handle it. I think it's very hard for us to completely get our heads around the geopolitical revolution that has taken place in the world, because we have all lived for decades now in a world that was completely unnatural, unusual. It might even be unique in modern geopolitical history. That is, we lived in a world from the end of the Cold War, from 1989, let's say roughly speaking, to the invasion of Ukraine, in a world without constant, deep, continuous geopolitical rivalry, tension, competition. That's a very unusual phenomenon in human history. If you go back and ask yourself, you look at the beginning of that era, it begins with the first Gulf War, in which the Soviet Union joins the United States in a coalition against Saddam Hussein, in which every Arab country, many of which had been pro-Soviet, and now join and even contribute troops, even countries like Syria. It was a period when the Russian government, the Chinese government, and the American government were cooperating, in a sense, in trying to handle the North Korean proliferation problem. It's unimaginable today to think of a world like that. And why was it? It was because at the end of the Cold War, we had this unique geopolitical circumstance, a world with one superpower, a world really that had, it's difficult to think back. You'd probably have to go back to the Roman Empire to think of a circumstance of that nature. And the fact that we lived through it, I think, makes us not completely realize how historically, how anomalous it is. So if you ask yourself, why was there no great geopolitical tension and crises, competition during that period? Well, in 1990, China was 1.5% of global GDP. And it was desperately seeking entry into the international economy, which only Washington could give it. Russia was, between 1990 and 1995, the Russian economy contracted by 50%. That is more than it contracted during World War II. By the end of that process, Russia was completely on its knees, facing insurgencies in places like Chechnya. Who else could have been a geopolitical challenger or rival to the United States, or the other two richest countries in the world, or Germany and Japan, both of which live under the geopolitical protection of the United States, under America's nuclear umbrella, and by the way, have complicated histories of their own in which deter them from seeking great geopolitical ambition. And so that was the world of the 1990s. And as a result of it, we saw a series of trends that I think as all good Americans, we assume was simply the natural fulfillment of every human being's natural aspirations, which is we saw a great move towards liberalization of economics, a great move towards the democratization of politics, and a great move towards the expansion and explosion even of information and information technology. And all of these trends, these three revolutions, if you will, these three motor forces reinforced one another. So the liberalization was helping the democratization, both were helping the expansion of the information revolution, and it all felt very natural. But we forgot, I think, as sometimes Americans do, that all this rested on a geopolitical edifice. It rested on the reality of American power. And as that reality began to change, we began to see those epiphenomena also changing. So if you look at how this begins to change, probably you would start with the Iraq War, right? The kind of first dramatic challenge to the legitimacy of American military power and the aura of American military power. The most powerful country in the world spends more than the next 20 countries put together on defense, was not able to get its way in a country 6,000 miles away, that had an economy that's smaller than one of America's smallest states. If you think about the 2008 financial crisis, that's another great blow to America's aura. It may even be a bigger one in many ways, because it around the world, countries had been aspiring to become more like America economically. Maybe not politically, maybe not culturally, but certainly economically. And the cracking of that American model, the sense that America did not have the most sophisticated form of capitalism, it did not have the most sophisticated markets, that this was all much more fragile than people realized, had a huge and deep impact around the world. There's a wonderful example that Hank Paulson gives in his memoirs, where he goes to Beijing and meets Wang Qishang, one of the great mandarins of Beijing. And Wang Qishang tells him, my friend, we used to think you were our teacher. Whenever, it was true. Whenever the Chinese would try to figure out, how do you structure our version of the SEC? They'll be like, what do the Americans do? How do we structure our version of a central bank? What do the Americans do? And he said, and we've come to realize you have nothing to teach us anymore. And that was a feeling not entirely absent in many, many countries around the world. And the third, of course, was the rise of populism, the rise of Donald Trump, the dysfunctions that the populism and partisanship brought, Congress unable to pass bills, the debt ceiling being raised, becoming a kind of repeated near existential crisis. All that damaged the political model. And so you go where your military aura, your economic model, and your political prowess all in some way have eroded. But of course, it's not entirely or even largely maybe an American story. What's also happening in this same period is a change in the external environment. And what you are getting very simply is the rise of China and the return of Russia to the world stage, each bringing with it enormous complications and geopolitical challenges. And we'll talk about those in a minute, but I want to signal one other piece of it, which has made the environment so complicated. And that is a phenomenon that I have previously described as the rise of the rest. What I mean by this is that you have seen over the last 30 years the rise of a series of middle powers that are much more economically successful, politically stable, culturally confident, and geopolitically active than they were before. And I'm thinking here of the Indias, the Brazils, the Indonesias of the world. Take Turkey as an example. Turkey 40 years ago was a loyal NATO ally, a basket case economy that was bailed out by the United States every now and then, run mostly by the generals in Ankara. And when Washington told Turkey what to do, it smartly saluted and did it. Since then, the Turkish economy has grown fivefold. It has become politically much more stable. It has a very charismatic and quasi-authoritarian elected president who routinely defies what the United States wants. In fact, has almost defined his foreign policy in some way in opposition or in a measure that he can stand up to Washington. And that reality is part of the mix of what the world has to deal with today, and what the United States has to deal with. But centrally, of course, the challenge relates to the rise of China. The rise of China is the single most important geopolitical event of the last 50 or 75 years. It is probably the most important geopolitical event to have taken place in the international system since the rise of Germany and Japan about 100 years ago. You don't get many new entrants into the great power club. It takes a long time. These countries have been remarkably constant for the last 400 years. China is the new entrant. And the rise of China has presented the United States with a fundamental challenge in terms of how it handles this world. Without going back into the history, remember when Nixon makes the opening to China, China is one of the poorest countries in the world. It has a per capita GDP of about 250. That in the first few years, the United States does $70 or $80 million of trade with China. And that is almost irrelevant to the reasons for the opening. The fundamental reason, of course, has to do with the Cold War and the fact that China represents the single most important geostrategic shift you could make in terms of that alignment. 1/3 of the Soviet army was tied up on the Chinese border in the 1970s. That transforms with the extraordinary economic growth of China, what Jeff Sachs calls the fastest and most successful case of economic development for any country in history. And I think that's clear. And so it has presented us with the problem, with the challenge that we face today. And I would say that we are now in a world where the old paradigm has gone away, but we don't know what to do, where the new paradigm is. The old paradigm was that we were trying to help integrate China into the world. We were hoping that China would become, in Bob Zoellick's phrase, a responsible stakeholder in that world. And we imagined that we would be able to cooperate with China and engage with China in solving a whole series of global challenges. This path was not entirely, was not as naive as people make it out to be. The transformation in China was really the largest rogue regime in the world under Mao Zedong, particularly in his later years, to what it became under Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. It was really quite remarkable. China went from fomenting, funding, and arming revolutionaries all over the world, from Latin America to Africa to Southeast Asia to India, to a country that was basically a status quo power, funding the UN, funding UN peacekeeping, trying to cooperate on all kinds of issues. As late as 2008, it is China's economic coordination with the United States that probably was the most important single piece of ensuring that the world economy didn't go into another Great Depression. But that world has shifted. And it's shifted largely because China has adopted a very different policy. Now, whether China has adopted that different policy because of the inevitable rise of Chinese power or because of the Xi revolution is something historians will debate for a long time. But what we can say is there has been a Xi revolution. And the revolution has been fundamentally along 3 lines. The first has been the assertion of political control, Communist Party control within China, which was his first and paramount objective. There are reports that almost 4 million members of the Chinese Communist Party have either been purged, demoted, disciplined, jailed as part of this much larger reassertion of control over Chinese society and over the Chinese people. The second has been a fundamental transformation, or transformation would be maybe a too strong a word, but a reevaluation of the economic model that China has adopted, much more heavily weighted towards the state, much more heavily weighted towards national self-resilience, and much less towards markets, openness, and trade. Remember, Xi Jinping's seminal Made in China speech was made in 2015, 1 year before Donald Trump was elected president. And the third, of course, has been the aggressive role that Xi has taken on with the rest of the world, particularly with countries in Asia, particularly major powers in Asia with which China has long had complicated relations. And so if you put all those together, there is no doubt that China has changed, but the United States has also changed in terms of the way in which it regards China. And again, historians will debate whether this was part of the rise of China's capacities and capabilities, or whether this was the shift in China's intentions. It so happens that the two things happen quite close together. And so it's very difficult to parse exactly which precipitated which. But roughly around the time that Xi Jinping comes to power, you begin to see this fundamental shift in Chinese economic policy, political policy, and foreign policy. And now we face the reality that the old model in that context is impossible to imagine. Xi Jinping does not want to be a responsible stakeholder upholding what he regards as a Western-led, American-dominated international system. That option of China being a kind of loyal lieutenant to the American world order is not in the cards. And so the question is, where do we go? The American political debate and almost all domestic impulses are pushing us in the direction that we understand. It's familiar, which is essentially a kind of second Cold War with China. And that's the rhetoric you hear coming out of Washington these days. It's something you hear prominent academics like Neil Ferguson talk about. And it makes some sense in a way. You know, you almost think back, well, we had this big rivalry with the Soviet Union when it was the other big power in the world. Maybe that's what we're replaying with China. But I would argue that the Cold War analogy is actually a very bad one to use in this particular case. It fundamentally misunderstands the nature of the world we're in and the nature of the challenge that China presents us with. So to begin with, take a look at the world we're in. The most deeply interdependent, globalized world economy ever in history. People talk about the world being globalized in 1914 before World War I. First of all, it had stopped being as globalized for several years before that. There had been a move towards nationalism and mercantilism and things like that Rush Doshi has written about. But more importantly, even at the peak of that period of globalization, it was really just the globalization of trade. The Brits made stuff, they sold it to the Germans made stuff, they sold it to the Brits. What we have now is a deeply complex, interpenetrated system of investment, capital flows, manufacture. So a Boeing, a General Electric jet engine is made in about 16 countries. Economists genuinely do not know whose GDP that jet engine should be ascribed to. You know, people often forget these measures are archaic. GDP is a 1930s measure that came out of closed, protected domestic economies. It's not clear how you would how you would evaluate where the GDP, where the sales of the iPhone should go, given how many countries it's made in. People often say the iPhone is made in China. It's actually made in 15 Asian countries. Its final assembly takes place in China. All the high-value design is done in Cupertino, California. We're not sure, right? That is the world we're living in. And in that world, China is a much, much larger player than the Soviet Union ever was. The Soviet Union was a bit player in the world economy. It almost had no role. Even if you just take the GDP numbers, which overstate the Soviet Union's importance, the Soviet Union was about 7% of global GDP. China is 20% of global GDP. It's almost 3 times the size. But much more importantly, China is the most important trading nation in the world. It is the largest trading partner of 120 countries, much more than the United States. It is the largest trading partner of the majority of countries in Latin America. It is the largest trading partner of all but 3 countries in Asia. It has a larger trade with Europe than the United States does. So all these factors make you realize that this is a very, very different challenge than the Soviet Union provided. The natural consequence of this is when you ask yourself, if you had a Cold War policy toward China, would you find it easy to find allies in this endeavor? And I would argue it'd be much, much more complicated. And you can see this when you listen to the president of France, who is a ambitious, pro-American, pro-Atlantic statesman, say, we cannot wed our policy on Taiwan to the United States. And while other statesmen might have disagreed with that, but I noticed Chancellor Scholz in Germany disagreed. But of course, next week he was in China trying to sell German cars to the Chinese. The French economy, by the way, would collapse if they couldn't sell overpriced luxury goods to the Chinese. That seems to me to have become the basis of the French economy right now. But it's not just them. If you look at economy after economy, there are deep connections with China. And I'm not even getting into the Belt and Road Initiative and things like that. You see how complex the issue is when you look at a country like Italy, which first signed up for the Belt and Road Initiative, then under pressure from Washington rebuffs it and disassociates itself with China, and now has quietly sort of signed up to it again. Because there is, at the end of the day, a desire for all of these countries to be actively engaged with the second largest economy in the world, right? I was in Saudi Arabia 3 weeks ago, and one of the messages I got from senior officials there was, we are a very happy place with the United States. We have found the Biden administration extraordinarily productive and engaged in terms of the kind of things we're talking about, obviously referring to the normalization deal with Israel. So the one thing that will be a constant thorn if the Americans push it will be China. They said, the senior official said to me, please, can you just remember, you don't buy any oil from us anymore. Our single biggest customer is China. And we are going to have good relations with China, whether you like it or not. And that is a sentiment that recurs in country after country. The Prime Minister of Singapore has very famously said, don't force countries to choose between America and China. I think the fundamental divergence is that most countries are looking at this relationship, these two countries, and thinking of an a la carte menu. They all want engagement with China economically, and they all want geopolitical insurance from the United States. And so they look at that and say, well, I wonder if we could have both. And what both the Chinese and the Americans are veering towards is saying, no, it's actually a fixed price menu. If you want the geopolitical insurance, you've got to get rid of Huawei. And the Chinese are saying the opposite. And that is the tension that is playing itself out right now. And we should be, I think, cognizant of that. There's a broader point to make, which is that the Soviet Union had ambitions that were different from China's. The Soviet Union really was a global revolutionary power that was trying in various ways to undermine both the geopolitical structure, but also the domestic economic and political structure of countries all over the world. I mean, this began in the 40s in Europe, and they were funding the communist parties in France and Italy. It persisted in every country in the world. And when you would ask the leaders of the Soviet Union, when you ask Brezhnev, what is your goal? You'd say worldwide communist revolution. And that was their goal until Gorbachev. And that was not, from Angola to Nicaragua to Cuba to Vietnam to Korea. They made those efforts. They paid enormous prices for it. They sent arms and weapons. They risked a nuclear war in Cuba. That is not China. If you ask, and Xi Jinping regularly gives speeches about this, if you ask what the goal of the Chinese government is, of the Communist Party is, it is the rejuvenation of China. And that is a very distinct and different goal. In a sense, China is trying to become great again, one might say, right? And that goal is a very different goal from the existential system versus system challenge that the Soviet Union placed. China is trying to rise as in some sense, a normal great power and occupy the space that a normal great power would. That means it presents an enormous challenge along many, many dimensions, political, economic, but it is not the same thing as an existential struggle for systems. For those of us who lived through the Cold War, we know the difference. And China is not, in that sense, an ideological threat. For one thing, China does not really have a coherent ideology. It's a strange mishmash of Leninism, capitalism, Confucianism, patronage, all fused together in the hope that this thing holds together. I would commend to your attention a Chinese television show called When Mao Meets Confucius, which is a perfect expression of China's internal incoherence about this, because I think somebody must have pointed out to Xi Jinping, because he's been giving all these speeches about how terrible it was that China was being influenced by the West, how China had to have its own distinctive Chinese path. It was, deeply rooted in its Confucian culture. And somebody must have pointed out to him, there's one problem with this, dear leader, which is that we have adopted a political and economic model, according to your own rhetoric, that was written up by a German Jew in the 1840s. And how do we square that with this long tradition of Chinese, Confucianism? Well, the TV show literally tries to square that circle. Every episode, Marx and Confucius meet. And Confucius will say to Marx, I thought that when you were emphasizing these things, they were very non-Chinese and they didn't come out of our history. And then Marx will say, well, actually, when you think about it, these are deeply rooted in your history. And you would not be surprised to learn that at the end of every episode, they happily conclude that actually all the things that Marx was saying were all hidden and buried in Confucianism anyway. So there's no contradiction. So Xi Jinping can continue to talk like that. But my point is, you see how difficult it is for them to come up with a coherent ideology of their own, let alone export it. I've been to so many countries around the world where people tell me, we're going to adopt the Chinese model. And I say, good luck, because the Chinese don't know what the Chinese model is. And really what you just mean is you want to get rich and you don't want to give up power. That is the Chinese model. And it's not easy to replicate that, as many countries have found in making this effort. That reality places, I think, an enormous limit on the nature of the ideological struggle that we have to face. And the final difference between the Cold War and what we're going through right now, I think has to be, we have to recognize something which is, people don't seem as aware of in the political climate these days. The United States is enormously powerful, particularly when you put its allies together. The plausible argument could have been made in the 50s that the Soviet Union was growing faster than the United States. You looked at Sputnik and the space race, and the Soviets were ahead without any question at some points. Europe was recovering from World War II. The United States today is more powerful than it has been really at any moment that I can think back on. If you look at the 10 top companies in the world in 1989, 4 were American, 4 were Japanese, and 2 were European. Today, 9 out of 10 are American. The only one, by the way, that isn't is Saudi Aramco, which is, it's not really a company, that's a government. If you look at per capita GDP, the United States is now in a league of its own. In 2008, the United States and the Eurozone were the same size. Today, the United States is twice the size of the Eurozone. You might think that I'm cheating by taking Britain out. Throw Britain in, we're still twice the size. If you look at wages, the United States real wages are 77,000. Europe's are now 41,000. By the way, 30 years ago, our wages were the same as Europe's. So the real story of the last 3 decades has been the United States has broken out and has become really the dominant economic player in the world. 3 American companies, even today, 3 American companies have a market capitalization that is larger than the entire German stock market. I don't mean 3 of them together. I mean separately. NVIDIA alone is larger than the entire German stock market, as is Apple, as is Microsoft. And one could go on and on. Britain had this fantasy that it was going to, after Brexit, join the United States in a kind of quasi-51st state. It would be very disappointed to learn that it would be the 51st poorest state in the United States. Great Britain's per capita income right now is below Mississippi's. So that is where we really are in terms of, and then if you add to that the strength of Europe, of Japan, of Korea, of Australia, of Canada, of Singapore, and maybe of India. We have with us the architect of the United States' pivot to India, Kurt Campbell, who has been laboring to get India on board this kind of what I call the West Plus. And if Kurt succeeds, then we're up to 75% of global GDP in one camp, 85% of global military spending in one camp, 95% of global agenda setting in one camp. So it's important that we run fast, but that we don't run scared when thinking about China. Right-sizing the Chinese threat, and not succumbing to the kind of fantasies that we often do. Remember, we thought the Soviet Union was ahead of us in missiles, had a larger economy than ours, was on the verge of taking over the world. Then we thought Saddam Hussein, who had nuclear weapons, was going to take over the Middle East. We have a tendency to exaggerate the strength of our enemies. If we are able to right-size the Chinese threat, challenge, and indeed in some areas threat, I think we'll be able to handle it much more. The final point I want to make is about the way we should think about this, which is not really as a Cold War, but as a cold peace. By which I mean we exist within a global economic environment, both China and the United States. We have to find ways to coexist. But within that coexistence, there will be deep and active confrontation, there will be deep and active competition, and there will be the need for, at least from the American perspective, deterrence on issues like Taiwan, on issues like South China Seas, on issues relating to the Philippines, and probably India as well. In all of those cases, the United States has to ask itself, how does it handle a situation where it is 8,000 or 9,000 miles away, 10,000 miles away? How does it manage to provide the kind of deterrence that is credible and effective? Most challenging, obviously, in Taiwan, with regard to Taiwan. But that challenge is different from the kind of Cold War, continuous existential, military, political, ideological, cultural clash that was taking place every day in every part of the world. These are discrete challenges in China's sphere of influence that have to be managed. But I want to pull back and talk about where it's important we don't go. So, and I think broadly speaking, what I'm describing is something that has been compatible with the Biden administration's approach, except that there is a political dynamic which clearly forces the ratcheting up of this process. So the Biden administration comes out with a certain number of technologies that it is trying to ban the Chinese from acquiring. And then you notice there is an expansion, and you notice there's an expansion. And that's, to my mind, inevitable given the political climate we live in. Nobody is going to get any plaudits in Washington for saying, let's relax one or two of these, or let's waive one or two of these tariffs. So let's, right, the political incentives are only in one direction, which is to be more and more hawkish towards China. So the danger is not that we actively plan to enter a Cold War with China, but that we stumble into one because the political dynamic within Washington and within the country makes it impossible to go in any other direction. And that is, it seems to me, the most important challenge to ask ourselves, can we face? And the line I think we should think about is, the challenge from China is a national security challenge. That is the one we should be exercised about. That is the one we should be focused on. And I think, therefore, the way that the Biden administration, for example, has approached the issue of technology is exactly right, which is to say, if there are technologies at the very cutting edge of computer science that if the Chinese were to get and were to incorporate into their military systems would pose a national security threat to the United States, we seek to deprive them of those. But those comprise about 5% of the chips that are being sold in the world. The other ones, we still, if you can go to Walmart or Amazon and buy Chinese computer chips by the dozens, by the hundreds. And the reason I think that it's important to focus in on the national security part of this is that the United States does not do itself well when it turns itself into a mercantilist, protectionist country where the government is the leading driver of economic policy. We've seen that movie. That hasn't worked out so well. And you can see the foibles of it even now. I mean, look at who is getting the vast majority of America's industrial policy money right now. It's Intel. Intel is basically a company that has failed to compete with TSMC. Miserably failed in terms of the production of chips. And so what does it get? It gets a $5 billion check from the federal government saying, try again. Not only had it failed in the past, it's already failed in the future, because in the all-important area of design, the chips of the future are being made by NVIDIA. So Intel has failed in the past, it's failed in the future, but what's the result of that? It got another $5 billion check from the federal government. And by the way, the Europeans are giving it a $10 billion check. Intel is basically becoming a ward of the state. It seems to me that this is inherent in the nature of this kind of policymaking. We're not going to pick the young, crazy, startup, scrappy company that says, I'm going to make computer chips for video games. No, we're going to pick the guys who are in suits, who you don't get fired for hiring. We're going to pick, the IBM, not the Microsoft. And that is the nature of this. But even beyond what it does to us, the American world system has been so revolutionary after World War II, because we came up with a model where we said, we are going to underwrite stability. We are going to create an open economic system, and we are going to let others thrive within it. Well, we said to the Japanese and the Germans, remember these were our blood foes just a year ago. We said, if you want to get rich, that's great. If you want to get prosperous, that's great. Just don't challenge us for geopolitical dominance of the world. And what happened is you created a world in which these countries found an outlet for their talent, their ambition, their energy. If we entirely deprive China, a country of 1.4 billion people with the second largest economy in the world, an enormous energy ambition, if we say to them, we want to thwart you economically, and we want to thwart you geopolitically, we will find ourselves in a very difficult circumstance. The only analogy I can think of is the period before World War II, when the United States embargoed energy for the Japanese. And the Japanese could find no other path but a frontal geopolitical challenge to the United States. We should remember that what has made the American world order so extraordinary, so revolutionary, so stable, and so enduring is that we had within it room for others. We understood that if we create a world that's open, free, and dynamic, we will do fine, but others will do fine too, and it limits the amount of the challenges you face. So if we can stay true in a sense to that American Revolution, the Revolution of 1945, the international revolution, I believe we'll find a way to have not a Cold War with China, but a cold peace. And at the end of the day, and maybe it's because I'm an immigrant, I think we'll win the cold peace. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Fareed. That was just terrific. If you like that presentation he just made, then I would urge you to get his book, The Age of Revolutions. I have a copy of it right here. It is terrific. And I would direct your attention particularly to Chapter 9, which talks about a lot of the things you talked about here. I think you'll really enjoy it. It's just terrific work. And I want to ask you about that Chapter 9, because it's titled In the Midst of a Dual Revolutions. And you talk about the geopolitical revolution that you talked about, the decline of Pax Americana, the rise of the West. China is a peer competitor. Russia is a thorn in the side of almost everything we're trying to do. And I think that's familiar to people here. But you say there's a second revolution that this all occurs in the context of, which is the emergence in the last 50, 60 years of a liberal international order based on freedom, democracy, rule of law, human rights, that is a set of norms and principles that have encouraged the kind of interdependence you described of trade and investment and communications and the like. And there is a suggestion, modestly made, that that liberal international order can in some sense be a bit of a mitigator or a buffer to what would other be an outright great power competition between the United States and China, and allow us in some sense to avoid the Thucydides trap or a war between the United States and China. I wonder whether that's a little tad optimistic, particularly when you see we are in a cycle, both by the United States and China, each dismantling that interdependence between our two countries, whether it's trade, whether it's investment, whether it's communications, whether it's technology sharing and all the rest. It seems to me that international order is in some sense being dismantled by China and the United States, at least as between the two of them. And therefore, I just wonder whether it really can serve the function that you seem to suggest in Chapter 9.
Well, I mean, as one can expect, Steve, you asked the central question. So the central question is, can the United States have this competitive, conflictual relationship with China, making the kind of moves I'm describing, and not have that not result in a kind of cascading effect where the decoupling becomes bigger and bigger, and the decoupling turns into a kind of unwinding of the interdependent global economy. The reason I'm somewhat more optimistic than your question suggests is, look, I said that the United States and China did about $75 million of trade in the first few years after Nixon's opening. We now do $750 billion of trade with China. We traded with the Soviet Union about $2 billion a day at the peak of US-Soviet trade. $2 billion a year with the Soviet Union. We trade $2 billion a day with China. The things that the Biden administration at least has done affect a very small number of those things. So even if you look at the new tariffs that were put in place, they affect 4% of the goods that are traded between the United States and China. So the challenge is, and this is the challenge Kurt Campbell faces, is can you design artfully a kind of a surgical policy where you have these areas where you set aside, or do they bleed and do they keep expanding? So far, I think I've been struck by how little they have bled. Why? The Chinese know they need our market, so they're not retaliating nearly as aggressively as one might think. We have actually kept it by and large fairly strategic, fairly contained, fairly limited. But I think if you get somebody like Trump in, and he does what he says, which is 10% tariffs all over the world, 60% tariffs toward China, then you almost certainly do have a kind of unraveling of that world that we were describing. And I think then you do end up in a situation which is, to my mind, fraught with enormous danger, because in a world that is significantly deglobalized, there are two countries that will actually do okay: the United States and China, because they have huge internal economies. And so you could imagine a kind of autarkic world order where these two countries, 85% of America's economy is still domestic, and the Chinese being able to face off. What will get really crushed is all the other countries. I mean, Germany's economy is 50% trade. And so all those countries will be scrambling. They'll be trying to figure out how do they align themselves. And so there is a kind of nightmare scenario, but so far we have managed to do this kind of strategic trade without it bleeding. But I do worry exactly about the dynamic you talk about. And it's, again, very hard. Look, Biden came in, he campaigned saying the Trump tariffs were stupid, Americans were paying the price, they were not working, all of which was true. And he hasn't reversed one of them. Right. Because the political will that it would take to reverse them is great. I mean, it's easy for somebody like me to say you should reverse them, and I've written that often and had a conversation with the president about it. But it's much harder when you have to, when you see the opinion polls every day.
We're going to run a little long. I have dispensation to go to 20 of 7. I'm going to ask one more question, then we'll go to the audience. And it's related to what you just said. One of the things that's in Chapter 9, you talk about how the liberal international order was really created and sustained first by the UK and then by the United States, and that is now at issue. Americans are becoming disenchanted with that role as both burdensome and costly. And you wrote something in an op-ed that appeared in August 2nd in the Washington Post. There is a broader point here to make. The United States did something truly revolutionary after World War II. It understood that by underwriting international stability and helping other nations to get rich, it would create a zone of peace and prosperity in which it too would thrive. That vision of enlightened self-interest has been at the heart of America's engagement of the world for almost 8 decades. Americans now seem to be questioning whether they want to play that role. The World War II generation, I would say the Cold War generation, understood its importance intuitively because of their own world experience. Young people today don't have that experience. What is the case? How do you make the case to young people today that that vision is still in the best interest of the United States?
You know, I think young people understand the enormous opportunities that the world provides. I think young people are generally more optimistic about this world that they're entering into, particularly young people who have some degree of college education, skills, training. As I said, I mean, they're looking at a world in which they can see the United States is absolutely dominant. The problem, if I can be totally honest and without sounding partisan, is that it's, what has happened is you have an older working class group of people who feel like the world has left them behind. They have found in the Republican Party a home, and they have found in Trump a spokesman. And to me, that's the most dangerous thing that's happening here, which is this, as you know, Steve, you were a Republican National Security Advisor and a proud internationalist and somebody who really, so completely understood the forces that I was describing. That Republican Party has disappeared. And I worry a great deal about a situation where for the first time in 8 decades, we're having a debate not about how America should engage with the world, but whether it should engage with the world. And to have one party solidly in one camp on this now is very worrying, because what happens, I am not one of the people who is as panicked about Donald Trump becoming president again domestically. I think we're a very strong country. We have a lot of institutions. We have all kinds of checks and balances. We don't have them with regard to foreign policy. The president can do whatever he wants. He can put these tariffs in. He doesn't even have to withdraw from NATO, by the way. He just has to say, I don't think I'm going to defend the Poles. I don't think I'm going to defend the Ukrainians. They don't pay their bills. And you say that, and because what is NATO? NATO is at the end of the day, it's a confidence game. You are telling, the Russians, don't try this because we will be there. If you do something that weakens that country, you can have the treaties, you can have the buildings, everyone can have wonderful meetings, but that one statement will be enough to unravel the whole system. And so to me, the fact that we are moving in this partisan direction where the two parties, people forget, but this was why the world was, the first part of the 20th century was as unstable as it was, because the United States was divided on whether it should be part of the world. Woodrow Wilson proposed that we join the League of Nations. The Henry Cabot Lodge refused in the Senate. That produced American withdrawal from the League. That produced the strange circumstance where you're in an international system where the most powerful country in the world had withdrawn, right? I worry that in that sense, history is replaying itself.
Let's go to the audience now. I would ask you, this is on the record, and I would ask you to identify yourself before you ask your question. And we'll go for about 10, 15 minutes, and then some of us have to catch a bus. Questions?
Hi. Hello. Hi. My name is Nancy Chen. I'm an economics professor at Northwestern University. Thank you for the great talk. So like you, I'm an immigrant, and I share your views about confidence in America. But one question I wanted to ask is this idea that America has always seen plenty of space for the enrichment of other countries. And I'm thinking of Japan in the 1980s, right? There was Carter and then President Ronald Reagan. As Japan was getting richer and richer, even though it was an ally, at some point, the Reagan administration imposed $300 billion worth of tariffs. We were trying to get the semiconductor back to the US, and in the end, it didn't work. Despite all of these efforts, the Taiwanese produced semiconductors. And in the meantime, as you said, we could get them, we knew they would do what we wanted because they depended on us for geopolitics. So I wonder, is one of the difficulties of what's happening in the US with respect to China now, the fact that it's not enough to be as good as we used to be, but we actually need to be better than we used to be?
Yeah, and it's a very good point you make, and it's a very important history. I do hope that all the people who are planning this new American trade strategy and industrial policy would spend a little time looking at the Japanese, looking at the 1980s in Japan, because people forget, we really thought the Japanese were taking over the world. I mean, when Kurt and I were at Harvard, Ezra Vogel was the great doyen of Asian studies, and he wrote a book, a best-selling book called Japan as Number One. And people routinely, I started editing foreign policy in Foreign Affairs magazine in 1992. And what I was so struck by now, looking back at I was looking at some of my correspondence, was you remember the Japanese stock market peaks in 89, 90. Everyone assumed that was a temporary crash. I had boatloads of articles in 92, 93 telling me that Japan is going to take over the world. We are being stupid. This is a head fake. There were a whole bunch of people who were explaining to me, and it was all the same arguments you hear about China. They have a Mandarin bureaucracy, which is genius at identifying the industries of the future. They can centralize resources and deploy them. And it was all these, it was HDTV, robotics, the chip making, and the whole thing collapsed. And as you say, every effort we made was a disaster, was a costly disaster. People forget Sematech, which you mentioned. We got Robert Noyce, the guy who invented the microchip, to head up an effort to create an American alternative Japanese chip making with essentially unlimited funding. It failed miserably. This is the genius of the market. You just can't do, you can't do these things. So my great hope is we will learn from our history. There are people like Kurt Campbell in government who know it well. And the truth is, here we may have caught a lucky break. China is going through very serious structural economic problems. And so it's very hard to argue, I think, that China is about to take over the world. I think China's problems are much deeper than people realize. They're much more structural than people realize. There's a very good article in Foreign Affairs right now about that. And I think that look, they're going to be the second largest economy in the world for the next 50 years. They're a huge, important player in the world. But this idea that they're going to be at the cutting edge, they're going to overtake us, all that I think is going to get, people are going to have a very different view of China. And then they do face the demographic problem, which is very real, and really no country has figured out a way to escape that. China's demographics are verging now on the worst in the world. Fertility is 2.1, you need to replace yourself. The United States is about 1.7, Europe is about 1.4, and we're fine because we have immigrants, so we actually, we get up to 2.1 anyway. But Europe is at 1.5, 1.4. The lowest in the world used to be South Korea, which was 1. China's new data suggests they're at 0.9. We've never seen anything like this, and this will be a kind of what the Chinese call the 1-2-4 problem. One working person has to now support 2 parents and 4 grandparents in a country without a pension system, without social security, without a healthcare and insurance system. So I think they're facing many challenges, and that might be a strange silver lining, because it will become harder and harder for people to make the case that China is about to take over the world. Now, of course, the super hawks in Washington, you got to love them, who were previously arguing that the reason to fear China and to have a Cold War with China is they were rising so fast they were about to take over the world. now argue that the reason to have a Cold War with China is because they're declining so fast and she might do something out of desperation. And so what you realize is no matter what the argument, the conclusion is always going to be the same.
You have time for one more question. Sir, right at the back. Yes, sir. You with the hand up in the plaid shirt.
Yes. Did you read that recently Dr. Vipin, my name is Russ Finch. I am a resident of San Diego. Dr. Vipin Narang.
Why don't we let the lady get a mic to you so that everyone can hear you, sir?
Yeah, my name's Russ Finch. I'm just a resident of San Diego. Let me get to it again. Vipin Narang, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy, recently said that we have discovered hundreds of new ICBM silos in China. How does that play into your view of the competition we have with them?
So there's no question the Chinese, I don't think that they pretend otherwise. They are engaging in a massive modernization of their nuclear weapons. My guess is they intend to close to quadruple the size of their arsenal. To a certain extent, what do you expect? They're going to be the second richest country in the world, right? Why would we expect that the things we did as we became more powerful and rich and influential, and we wanted, the influence and the deterrent power that comes with nuclear weapons, why would we assume that the Chinese would not? This is sort of what I meant when I said that old model is gone, that they're going to be living in some kind of quasi-shadow of American security. No, the Chinese are, I think we got spoiled by not realizing that the two countries that rose to power in the last 75 years, Germany and Japan, both chose to rise entirely economically with virtually no military component to it. But that was because they were, as I said, first of all, they had a bit of historical problems given what had happened, in the years 1939 to 1945. But they also lived within the security umbrella provided by the United States. China is not that. China has never been under this American security umbrella. So of course they're going to modernize their nuclear weapons. Of course they're going to, we've been trying to engage with them and get into some kind of arms control regime with them. And my gut is that their idea is we're going to build up to the point where we are, we have enormous power. We probably not quite parity with the US, but we're going to double, quadruple, quintuple our weapons, and then we'll talk. We're not going to talk right now because what talking will mean is you, Washington, are trying to retard the process of our modernizing our weapons. So I think the mistake here would be to massively overreact and to think this is the end of the world and we're approaching a nuclear war. No, I mean, look, they're doing what other great powers do, particularly great powers that lie outside the system. Just to remind you, Russia is 3,000. The Chinese have, I can't remember the exact number now, but a few hundred, but 600 maybe. They're trying to go up to 2,000, I would guess, 2,500. They're trying to get themselves in the range of the United States and Russia. I think we have to recognize that this is something I think it's difficult for Americans to understand. Other countries are going to do stuff that we do. And it's not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily mean it is as deeply destabilizing and threatening as we sometimes make it out to be. Other countries have national aspirations, global aspirations too. And so if we can find a way to understand that about China and then deter them in the places where it really is dangerous, where it is destabilizing, where it is expansionist and imperialist, I think we will have there'll be an easier chance for us to prevail. There'll be an easier chance for us to get allies when we do things like that. So when the Chinese do something like they did with the Australians, where they read them the Riot Act and gave them these points that they wanted the Australians to promise Beijing, including, by the way, that the entire Australian free press would never criticize the Chinese Communist Party, or when they do what they did in India, where they tried to gain 40 square miles of glaciers in the Himalayas. Don't ask me why. It's a kind of very bizarre move. That's when we should react, and we do react, and we should frankly exploit China's weaknesses. Xi Jinping is his own worst enemy. I mean, he has managed to alienate more of China's neighbors than anything we could have ever done. With the Indians, a good example. When you looked at Indian attitudes towards China, negative attitudes to China polled at about 30% before that Himalayan excursion. It's now at 70%. India has banned TikTok and every other Chinese app. So I think that the key is for us to, again, to right-size the threat, to keep our cool, and to realize that we have this enormous advantage that the Chinese don't. The big mistake I think Xi Jinping is making is that he doesn't realize the United States has had a unique experience as a world power in human history. It has grown rich and powerful, surrounded by two vast oceans and two weak neighbors. Sorry, Canadians and Mexicans, if you're in the audience. Right? So we don't threaten a lot of other countries. And I would like to say we are also virtuous, but forget that. We're so far away. We're 10,000 miles away from Asia. But China is not growing in that environment. China is growing in the most crowded continent in the world, cheek by jowl next to India, Japan. People often talk about the rise of Asia. It always made no sense to me, particularly as somebody who grew up there. There is no such thing as Asia. It's a Western construct. There's China and India and Japan and South Korea, and they mostly hate each other, right? So the idea that China can grow, in this benign American-style way is not going to happen. They're going to bump up against all that, and that is an enormous strategic advantage we have. We have 59 treaty allies. China has one, North Korea. Right? I mean, maybe you now throw in Putin, which has become, Russia has become a vassal state of China's. But we are in such a powerful, strong place. One of the things that I really think Americans, don't understand is the degree to which the United States has been able to achieve all of this because of this big-hearted, generous, confident, assured strategy. Think back in our history. Every time we've been paranoid, the internment of the Japanese Americans, McCarthyism, the panic over, Islamofascism, we haven't done things that have been good domestically, and it's never really worked out that well internationally. So I think if we can just remember our enormous and enduring strengths, we'll be fine.
欢迎来到六度解析新闻背后的多维思考，带你洞悉头条背后的世界。在今日华尔街频道的六度解析中，我们将深入探究时事热点，为你揭开新闻背后的真相。在这个信息泛滥、真相难觅的时代，六度解析应运而生。我运用海量数据、人工智能整合以及专家观点，层层剥析每个故事，通过实时背景数据挖掘，确保你获得全面的新闻资讯。然而，我们关注的不仅仅是数据，更重要的是将它们串联起来。我将分析多方视角，揭示隐藏的脉络，为你提供单一媒体常常忽略的背景信息。无论是政治、经济，还是全球事务，我都将为你带来最具洞察力的分析。试想一下，拥有洞悉全局的能力，做出明智的决策，参与有意义的讨论，这就是六度解析带给你的价值。它不仅仅是新闻分析，更是一种赋能的工具。加入今日华尔街的六度解析，共同探索头条背后的故事。你通往深度理解的旅程，从这里开始。不要只是阅读新闻，要解码新闻，理解新闻，活出新闻。这一切尽在六度解析。立即订阅，不错过任何真知灼见。因为了解真相仅仅是个开始。